When a picture is finished, it's successful, not successful. Well, I prefer to have a successful picture because it convinced the producers to ask me to make another one. That's the only reason. But to look at the picture, to watch the picture, I'm not interested. What interests me is to make it. It is to be on a stage with the actors, with the technicians, and to try to build up something. Now, something which makes it even more delightful is that I'm never making it alone. I'm trying to make it with the actors, with the technicians. I'm trying, to catch what they have in mind. I'm trying to discover human beings, and sometimes I do.
A scene from Jean Renoir's The Rules of the Game, a film that at the time of its release in 1939 was rejected by critics and public alike. Today, it is simply considered one of the finest films ever made. In 1967, François Truffaut wrote, "My judgment that Jean Renoir is the greatest filmmaker is not based on an opinion poll, but purely on personal feeling. This personal feeling is shared by other filmmakers. And in any case, aren't Jean Renoir's films about personal feelings?"
Whenever I want to convince myself that there is hope for the movies, that you can do something that's as eternal as a Mozart symphony, I look at it.
Are so close to life, and meantime they are completely cinema. How did he do it? It was a complete miracle.
Jean Renoir was the second son of the great Impressionist painter, Pierre-Auguste Renoir. His devotion to his father led him to write a biography of the artist.
My father was in love with life, and his whole entire life, his entire career, all his work is just a kind of cry of love for the world where he was living. Today we talk very much about creative art, creation, that's the word. My father didn't believe that he was creating anything. He just believed that he was copying things. He was copying things he loved, and that's all.
The Montmartre of today is only a neon-lit echo of the Paris that Auguste Renoir knew. It was here he lived at the end of the last century, and where his son Jean was born on September the 15th, 1894, just in sight of the dome of the Sacré-Cœur. Down a quiet pathway called the Allée des Brouillards could be found a row of houses inhabited by artists. Now mainly hidden by trees, these houses were known as the Château des Brouillards.
This is the house of Renoir, and waiting for us here is his son, Jean Renoir, one of the world's great film directors.
Welcome to Montmartre.
Thank you. Monsieur Renoir, if I'm not mistaken, you were born in this very house.
Yes, I was.
Montmartre was a very different place then.
Well, there is only one expression to describe Montmartre in those days. It was the Garden of Eden. It was simply wonderful. No big buildings, only small houses, prairies, cows, bushes, flowers. The houses were not too elegant, were not too comfortable, but they were beautiful.
Growing up in semi-rural Paris and Burgundy, Jean led a charmed adolescence in the artistic environment provided by his father. When Auguste became crippled by arthritis, his wife, Aline, moved the family to the south coast. At Cagnes-sur-Mer, the aging artist found the ideal world in which to spend his final years, a house known as Les Colettes. He was able to paint both in the studio and in the sprawling gardens and farmland that surrounded the house. Today, the grounds and house are a national museum, the furniture in place just as it was in the artist's lifetime. In 1962, Jean Renoir paid a visit to Les Colettes for a BBC Monitor film in which he spoke about life with his father.
The house was full of activity. We had people walking in the fields, we had people taking care of the olive trees, people taking care of the crop of the orange blossoms. You know, a big real activity. And my father loved to be in the middle of a real human activity. And I feel the same because of, you know, you don't live with a man like my father without being influenced. And I'm very much influenced by my father, and I'm happy I am. That helps me to be a little more happy in life. His idea, it was the purpose of art wasn't perfection. The purpose of art was to catch a little bit of the truth of a human being, or of a tree, or of a flower. Well, it was to establish a direct contact between himself and the flower, and perhaps through the flower or through the naked body of a girl, a direct contact with the unknown person who was going to look at the painting later.
Auguste Renoir was surrounded by women. He loves the company, women's company, and the domestic were also models. And he has 3 children, so it was quite a lot of people, of women, a female company around him.
Of all Renoir's models, the one who had the greatest influence over the young Jean was Gabrielle.
My mother was a distant cousin of Mrs. Renoir, Jean's mother. And she was from the same village. And she came to Paris to help Mrs. Renoir raise young Jean. In fact, he wasn't even born when she came.
Did he start painting her from the very beginning?
No. In the beginning, she was too busy with me. And or with my mother, and with the house. And she started to pose for my father because of me. My father loved to paint me, and Gabrielle had to bring me to the studio, and she was also posing, helping. And my mother had the idea to ask Gabrielle to pose. Gabrielle was perhaps 20 years old, she was beautiful. And of course, she did it very gladly, because to pose in the nude in our house was not at all amazing. It was something very, very natural.
She's the one that took him to the movies when he was... I don't know, 3 or 4 years old, I believe. It was the very beginning of the movies. I remember my mother saying that Jean was so overwhelmed with what he saw on the screen that he urinated in his pants.
Jean's first ambition was to wear the uniform of a soldier. At first, he enlisted in the dragoons, but he became bored with the cavalry and changed to the army, joining the chasseurs alpins. It was in April 1915 when, after months spent in the trenches, Jean was shot in the leg by a Bavarian sniper.
It was this leg that actually brought him into the picture business, because when he first had the wound, he sat with his foot up. And the best way to do that for him was to go to this newfangled thing called motion pictures. And he would sit in this darkened theater with his leg up, resting the leg primarily, and gradually fell in love with this medium.
Perhaps even I started in the movies because of Chaplin. And I will always remember the way it happened. I was a pilot in an air squadron, and a friend of mine told me, when you go to Paris, you should see Charlot. And I saw Charlot, And of course, I was convinced. Now, later on, of course, I didn't make movies right away. I didn't think I could make movies. But I got acquainted with other authors. And my big admirations were Stroheim and Griffith.
Serving in the Air Force, Jean's expertise in aerial photography increased his interest in the camera. When the war was over, Jean and his younger brother Coco returned to Les Colettes, while their elder brother Pierre resumed his career as an actor. Auguste's wife had died in 1915, but he took comfort in his discovery of a new model, André Höschling, known as Dédé. Jean would later write that her arrival was like the touch of a magic wand. She was to be the first great love of Jean's life.
Did he ever want you to become a painter?
Myself?
Yeah.
Oh, no.
Did
Oh,
he ever
no.
suggest it?
No, not at all. No. You know, he was, well, himself was remembering how difficult his life had been. I didn't want his sons to go through such difficulties.
His father, as you know, Auguste Renoir started his career as a ceramist. And at the end of his life, Auguste Renoir was worried about the career of Jean. And he pushed him to do ceramic and to stay in this nice villa, Les Colettes, and to live there and to work. So Auguste Renoir made the kiln, and Jean and Coco and Dédé, the last model of Renoir, start to work and to do some ceramic. This is a nice piece that Jean Renoir did in Les Colettes. As you can see, it's more influenced by Matisse than by his father.
Just after the death of his father in January 1920, Jean and Dédé were married. With their newborn son, Alain, they decided to move nearer to Paris. In Marlotte, near the forest of Fontainebleau, they bought a large mansion. Marlotte was a favourite town of artists, and it brought Jean close to his best friend, Paul Cézanne, the son of the great painter.
Paul was much older than my father, but somehow he had befriended the younger boy, so to speak. The two of them used to go boating, for instance, when they were young, you know, and do things like that. And they had remained terribly close. I mean, they were really like brothers, more than like friends.
The Cézanne family settled in Marlotte in an old farmhouse called La Nicotière.
À La Nicotière, à l'époque où il y avait mes parents, oh ben mes parents étaient très bohèmes. Et il y avait toujours énormément de monde. Il y avait beaucoup de jeunes. Mes parents recevaient beaucoup de jeunes. Et il y avait toujours table ouverte. On était toujours 14 ou 15 à table.
Au moins, je me rappelle quelquefois,
quelquefois
quand on mettait les
plus.
tables dehors.
Oui, on mettait des tréteaux avec des grandes planches. Et on s'installait dehors sur la terrasse. C'était toujours très gai. On organisait des grands jeux.
Et le fait que la famille Cézanne habitait ici attirait mon père. En plus du fait qu'il aimait la forêt. Et qu'il aimait la rivière le loin.
The idyllic life of Marlotte, with its river and canal, inspired Jean to direct his first film there, La Fille de l'eau. This simple tale of an innocent girl living on a barge was written by Jean for his wife, Dédé. She had changed her name to Catherine Hessling, believing it to sound more American. Jean financed the film himself, hoping it would realize her dream of becoming a movie star. Its supporting cast was comprised of friends, such as the writer Pierre Lestranguez, acting under the name Pierre Philippe.
His first films were made sort of as home movies, and with films made among friends in a locale that was very familiar. And the spirit of that pervades his whole career. So much so that when I asked him once about, you know, things about happiness, he said, well, happiness is working with people you love. And that's certainly a part of his life, and it's a part of the filmmaking, and it begins with those first films.
La Nicotière was one of many locations used by Jean in Marlotte.
Il avait choisi la maison de tes parents parce que la cour à l'intérieur avait l'air d'un village, c'est ça?
Oui, oui, il avait à chaque fenêtre, dans la cour, il y avait le marchand de cycles, et il avait tourné avec tous les acteurs, les amis de la famille. Alors il a tourné à la Nicotière, il a tourné à la comment ça s'appelle, en forêt, à la Marofée.
Ah oui, à la Marofée, c'est vrai, à la Marofée.
Puisque c'était ta mère qui jouait, elle avait le rôle principal.
Oui, elle avait le rôle principal.
Et il y avait un arbre dans lequel elle était sur une branche.
C'est ça, oui, je me rappelle de la scène dans le film.
De cette scène, bon, il a donc tourné là.
When I started in the movie, I didn't want to be a creator. I didn't want to tell my own stories. I didn't want to be a director. I was interested in technical work, trying to invent some tricks. But slowly, I was caught by, may I say, by the intoxication of telling stories. Following a little bit the advice of my father, who always told me, he used to say, you are a chatterbox. You talk too much. And since you talk too much, why don't you write down what you like to talk about?
J'ai l'impression qu'il n'a jamais pensé à retourner à la céramique. Hein, à revenir
à la céramique? Non, je crois pas, non. Après, il est reparti dans le cinéma.
Oui.
Hein.
C'est d'ailleurs ce qu'il... Je suis sûr que c'est ce qu'il avait l'intention de faire du commencement. Parce qu'il aimait raconter des histoires.
Oui, c'est vrai. Oui. Il était comme toi, hein. Plutôt tu es comme lui.
On ne sait pas, le fils peut être le père du père.
Je ne sais pas.
Renoir qui, disons, à ce moment-là était fou de cinéma, mais en grande partie fou de cinéma par le truchement de l'amour qu'il portait à Catherine Hesseling. La personne folle dans la famille était Catherine Hesseling, et à ce moment-là, Renoir ne voyait le cinéma que par les yeux de Catherine Hesseling.
Charleston was another Renoir home movie, reflecting not only his love for Catherine, but also jazz and the music hall.
Catherine Hesseling, John sometimes described as a fantastic actress. She does do interesting things in film. She is the center of the early films. She always is this sort of woman child, you know. She has a sort of duality of a certain peculiar kind. In Nana, she plays this famous character who, in the Zola novel, is really a force who ends up, you know, laying all of Paris to waste at the end of Nana. And it's hard to believe about Catherine Hesseling in that film.
Nana was an expensive attempt to make a fully professional film, with Catherine in the role of the unscrupulous prostitute with theatrical ambitions. In his direction, Jean also hoped to match the American cinema he had so admired, in particular, the erotic dramas of Erich von Stroheim.
Well, she was not a good actress, I don't think so. But she had a very strong personality. And the best film that she played was Nana, because it was the way that she was in life, you know.
Moralité, pratiquement, Renoir, pendant cette longue période, va faire les films avec son argent. Comme il n'en a pas beaucoup, son argent, c'est très simple. Dans la rue Ménil, il y a l'équivalent de 4 musées français. Quand il a besoin d'argent, il prend une toile qui est au mur, va la vendre en discutant ferme, et avec l'argent du tableau d'Auguste, son père, eh bien, on va pouvoir tourner 4 jours de plus.
Nana was a box office flop. Jean lost a small fortune, and Catherine Hessling failed to become a star. Jean's career as a film director continued without her. This had disastrous consequences for their marriage. The final separation occurred when Catherine lost the lead role to another actress, Jeannie Marez, in Jean's first major sound film, La Chienne. La Chienne was a drama about an innocent bank clerk, played by Michel Simon, who begins an affair with a prostitute. He fails to realize she and her pimp are exploiting him until finally he blunders in on them together in bed.
Ben oui, c'est mon petit homme qui est là. Il fait quoi?
Je pense que bon, ces films muets étaient formidablement intéressants, mais étant donné la nature de Renoir, son intérêt pour l'être humain, comme ça, il est bien évident qu'un être humain qui n'a pas de voix, c'est moins intéressant qu'un être humain qui parle. Et pour lui, comme il ne s'agissait pas du tout de problèmes esthétiques à ce niveau-là, c'était des problèmes presque de relations avec des éléments de création. Il est évident que le fait que le cinéma se mette à parler a été l'idéal.
Et si je ne le finissais pas?
Tu vas le finir, dis.
Alors c'est pour ça. C'est pour mes tableaux. Tu me voyais uniquement pour ça.
Non mais pourquoi que ce serait? Regarde-toi dans une glace.
Imbécile. Idiot dire que j'ai cru à ça. Ah, tiens, tu me dégoûtes.
Ben et toi? Tu crois que ça m'amusait? S'il n'y avait pas eu ton fric, comment que je t'aurais laissé tomber? Oh là là. Monsieur voulait être aimé pour lui-même. Monsieur voulait de l'amour. Oh, laisse-moi rire.
Saleté. J'ai pas une femme qui est une chienne.
Je pense qu'il a déjà très tôt, il a une vision très évidente de son écriture, donc également de l'utilisation du son, des chansons extérieures, enfin des contrepoints par les chansons, de certains bruits réalistes au milieu et extérieurs au milieu des histoires. Je pense qu'il l'a eu très tôt, ça. Je crois que ça faisait tellement partie de sa vision des choses qu'il l'a utilisé tout de suite.
Jean continued to innovate with Boudu Saved from Drowning, a satirical comedy with Michel Simon as a tramp adopted by a bourgeois household.
Attends une seconde. Oh, celui-là, par exemple. Oh, ce qu'il est beau. Oh, j'ai jamais vu un clochard aussi réussi. Mais
I don't think Jean ever really thought theoretically about how things ought to be, but he sort of felt how things would be right when he's making the film. And out of this feeling about how things should go and how things should look, there developed this style through the 30s, a style that involves a very fluid camera. He discovered that he liked to have deep space in his films, and the world was more interesting if the people in the space were arranged in depth rather than side by side and talking to each other.
The idea of depth of field, which he was a pioneer in, and the idea of the extended take, where the extended shot, where he really tried to cover all the thing in one piece of film, both, to my way of thinking, connect with Jean's discovery, I think, that if these actors really do all this and it's really happening, then it is real, because it did happen, and it isn't manipulated. It's something that the viewer sees and is unconsciously becomes aware that this is really happening, because it is.
Vous voulez que je vous embrasse?
Vous ne perdez pas la tête?
Non.
Est-ce que vous sauriez seulement?
J'en sais rien.
Ce serait la première fois que vous embrasseriez quelqu'un?
Non. Avant, j'avais un chien.
Un chien?
Il m'embrassait, lui.
Il vous léchait?
Oui, il me léchait.
Et vous? Vous l'embrassiez?
Oui.
Et ça vous faisait plaisir?
Vous voulez m'embrasser, vous?
Qu'est-ce qu'il est devenu, votre chien?
Oh, je sais pas, il est parti.
Vous deviez mal l'embrasser.
Non, je l'embrassais bien. Vous voulez m'embrasser, vous?
J'aime pas les hommes qui ont de la barbe.
Vous voulez que je la coupe?
Oui, coupez-la. Après, nous verrons.
Puis après, vous m'embrasserez?
Je sais pas, je verrai. Si vous me plaisez.
I came to him and I said, Jean, I said, what do you, I just saw Boudou Sauvé des Eaux. It's just extraordinary, I said. Hadn't seen it, this was in the 60s. I hadn't seen it till then. He says, oh, thank you, thank you. He always seems surprised when you compliment him. Oh, thank you, thank you. I said, what do you think of it? It's just extraordinary. What do you think of it, says I. He said, well, I think the sound is not so good with the early recording, and we had a problem with the film. We did not have the same stock, and so it's a little, and the editing is not so good. It's a little rough. The music is not very well recorded. Some shots are too long, some shots are too short. But I think maybe it is my best film.
The Renoir style developed through the 1930s to change the face of cinema. In Tourny, a provincial tragedy set among immigrant workers in the Midi, he filmed entirely on location, in a manner that later influenced the Italian neo-realist cinema. He then joined forces with writer Jacques Prévert to make Le Crime de Monsieur Lange. Set in Paris, it was a social comedy about workers in a printing house. The film strongly reflected the political mood of its times, with its actors drawn from a radical theatre group, among them the young Maurice Baquet.
À cette époque-là de Renoir, on trouvait dans chaque personnage une humanité dans laquelle les gens se reconnaissaient. Et dans le crime de Monsieur Lange, quand même, a été évoqué pour une des premières fois l'histoire d'une coopérative. La coopérative, puisque nous étions dans ce bain-là et nous étions heureux de participer à cette époque-là, tout en sachant bien que peut-être, mais on n'osait pas trop y penser que ça allait se terminer, mais on était heureux, l'amour était pour beaucoup dans ces choses-là.
Le projet d'une coopérative ne me paraît pas satisfaisant.
Comment ça et pourquoi
et je doute que M. Meunier de Lille, principal créancier,
Allez, tout va du coopérative, très intéressant, tout à fait d'accord. Encore un acrobate. Monsieur Meunier, fils. Fils, tu l'as dit, oui. Papa m'a envoyé. Papa malade, le foie. Il est à Vichy, le foie. Et papa avec. Alors il m'a envoyé pour régler l'affaire. Bonjour tout le monde, bonjour. Salut. Je vous l'ai dit 1000 fois, j'ai horreur des nœuds papillons. Mais pour la coopérative, alors là, tout à fait d'accord.
Ça va. Oui, monsieur Meunier, mais tout de même, moi, j'ai une option, n'est-ce pas?
Ah, grave, ça. Faudra te faire opérer, mon vieux. Allez, mon cher Buisson, allez-y, continuez votre exposé.
Et puisque monsieur Meunier n'est pas opposé à la création d'une coopérative, il n'y a pas besoin de discuter plus longtemps.
Permettez une seconde, j'ai quelque chose à vous dire. Excusez-moi, je reviens tout de suite. Écoutez, vous m'êtes tout à fait sympathique, vous savez, seulement voilà. J'ai horreur des nœuds papillons.
Ah oui?
Ah oui, mon fils. Oui.
Eh ben, moi, j'ai horreur des pochettes, figurez-vous.
Moi aussi.
On est d'accord, alors. Eh ben, qu'est-ce que vous disiez? Vous vouliez savoir quelque chose, non?
Non. Ah, si, mon vieux, voilà. Je vous avais un petit renseignement. Comprenez, je ne voudrais pas paraître trop bille vis-à-vis de mon père. Alors dites-moi, au juste, une coopérative, qu'est-ce que c'est?
Mais dites-moi, mais qu'est-ce que c'est qu'une coopérative? C'était merveilleux de penser que la question était posée en ces termes-là, à ce moment-là. Et Renoir était tout à fait d'accord avec ce genre de personnage.
With the threat of Nazism, the Popular Front in France rose up as a union of the left-wing parties.
Le Front populaire, c'est l'ordre. Le Front populaire ne sera jamais l'anarchie.
Despite the comforts and privileges of his background, Jean, like many artists of the period, was swept along by this movement. His major contribution was a commission by the Communist Trade Union to make an epic reconstruction of the French Revolution.
It was a period of enthusiasm. Many Frenchmen believed really that was the beginning of a new era of liberty, of happiness for the people, and also of, it was perhaps the beginning of the end of misunderstandings among Frenchmen. That was a dream.
Oh, c'est pas un tableau, c'est une fresque. Et moi, non? Allez, encore une fois. Eh ben, c'est pas tout naturel.
Tu sais qu'il est bon ton vin, citoyen?
C'est du vin argentin, il y a une vigne.
On met ça, hein?
Je crois qu'il avait une vraie morale, mais politique, je pense pas. Je pense que, par exemple, toute son époque de flirt avec le Parti communiste dans les années 36, ça correspondait à une véritable sensation et volonté de communion avec les gens, ça c'est certain, mais en même temps, c'est un homme qui avait trop le sens de l'individu et qui était pour accepter de sombrer dans une idéologie quelle qu'elle soit.
Jean himself never engaged himself. Surely he thought it would be foolish, because at that time the party was rather strict. You had to go to your weekly meeting of the local cell, and well, he said, no, I'm not going to do that.
As well as a regular number of assistants, a significant name appears on the credits of films of the 1930s. The editor, Marguerite. Although they were never married, she took Jean's name, as they had become partners in life as well as work.
Marguerite had her word. She would say, if suddenly she thought that he would not make a close-up, she said, Jean, please, if you don't give me a close-up, I cannot switch from one take to the other. If one is good at the beginning and the other at the end, how can I cut? I have nothing. So he said, oh, come on, yes, okay, Marguerite, okay, we'll do it. No, he always followed what she wanted, always. In a way, I think that the fact that he was living with Marguerite also in the year 36, politically, was a weight on his way of thinking, because she was really coming from the proletariat. She was a...
As a location, Jean found a forest ranger's house by his beloved river, the Loing. Planned as a short film, it was based on a Maupassant story about a party of Parisians on a summer's day trip who encounter a pair of bored young men. All role in the film to one of his assistants, the photographer Henri Cartier-Bresson.
Jean always wanted his assistant to know how it feels to be on the other side of a camera. And I was supposed to be a seminarist with Georges Bataille, who was her husband.
They'd gone to down there by the banks of the river where Jean said he knew every tree and the way that the light would be on every tree at every moment, and that's why he shot down there. It was a wonderful place. They went down there expecting to be there for a week or so, and it started raining, and it kept on raining. They went down, I think, sometime in June, and they were still there in September. Now when we look at it, it's certainly true, we don't find there's anything missing in it. It's just this wonderful little piece that looks like it could have been shot on a couple of afternoons, you know, among friends. But instead, you know, it was interminable.
I don't think there's ever been a film that captures that heartache of love from the woman's point of view to such a degree, and the difference in the way a man and a woman react to a passing, a fleeting romantic encounter. Humanity in his work, it's so rich with a sense of nuance in terms of the people. They are not black or white, and you know, there are no villains, there are no easy answers, there are no heroes either in a funny way.
There were no obvious heroes in La Grande Illusion. On the surface, an anti-war film about prisoners of war making their escape. Its real subject was the loyalty of class over nationality, expressed through the friendships between officers from opposite camps. The German captain was played by Erich von Stroheim, who as a director in silent cinema had inspired Jean to become a filmmaker.
Enchanté de vous revoir, pour Dieu. Je suis désolé de vous voir ici.
Nous aussi. Oui. Oui.
All he set out to do was to recapture some tales he had heard and some elements of which he had experienced in World War I, in which he served as a soldier. It became something more. It became a whole world. It became more than a war story. It became a story of nations and had a universality. And I don't think I'm being too general when I say that. I think this is why the picture has lived and will always live.
It was this film which first gave Jean a taste of success, both in Europe and America, and established his reputation as a director of international stature.
I think in the 30s, Renoir was quite different from other well-known as a French director. And he was not, and it's still by the people who survived, not liked by them. They did not think him as a director, maybe because he was not a tyrant on the set. He was not a dictator. On the set of Duvivier of Carnet, Autant-Lara, there was an atmosphere of, I would say, of war, of hate. Renoir was the opposite. He was putting his collaborators in a state of mind where they were bringing him things that he was stealing or taking, which is a great way to direct.
You know, I'll give you an example. For instance, you remember the scene in Grande Illusion between Gabin and Delio, when after they run away from the prison camp, and they're in the mountains, and the foot of Delio hurt so much that they cannot walk anymore, and they have to, well, Gabin has to abandon Delio alone in the mountains. And I had written many pages of dialogue, and I was very proud about this dialogue. I was reading my own work and thinking, God, is that good? And when I asked the actors to say this dialogue, they did it. But it was very bad. It sounded really awful. And I was telling them, but what's the matter? And finally, Gabin told me, the matter is that your dialogue is bad, and I cannot say it. And he was right, my dialogue was very bad. And I said, well, okay, let's forget about it. We will write something else. You know, we were in the mountains with the snow. We had to hurry. We had to take a decision. The night was coming down very quickly. And a grape had an idea. He told me, well, why don't you have them sing a little song? That would be much better than any dialogue. And I thought that it was a wonderful idea. And I had the idea of having them sing Le Petit Navire. Remember, il était un petit navire, il était un petit navire. And well, that's my story.
Alors, tu viens, quoi? Fais ce que je peux. Cavale avec ton pied. J'ai glissé. Pas ma faute, j'ai glissé. Ouais, t'as glissé. On le sait que t'as glissé. Et si on s'est poiré à traîner comme ça, t'iras leur raconter que c'est parce que t'as glissé, hein? Maladroit, là. On a même plus rien à bouffer, alors autant se rendre tout de suite. Oh, volontiers, parce que moi aussi, j'en ai marre. Là, c'est de moi, hein? Marre, j'en ai marre. Si tu savais comme je te déteste. Je te jure que je te le rends bien, va. Veux-tu que je te dise, est-ce que t'es pour moi un colis, t'entends? Un véritable colis. Un boulet que je traîne aux pieds. Puis d'abord, j'ai jamais pu blairer les juifs, t'entends? Un peu tard pour t'en apercevoir. Les filles, qu'est-ce que t'attends pour t'en aller? T'en crèves d'envie. Il faudrait pas que tu me le dises deux fois, bien sûr. Allez, fous le camp, vite, vite, que je vois plus ta sale trogne. Eh ben oui, je fous le camp, t'entends? Et puis déverse-toi dans tout seul, au revoir. Ensuite, au revoir, jamais. Tiens, je vais en pousser une, tellement je suis content. Il était un petit navire, qui n'avait jamais navigué, Au bout d'un 5, 6 semaines, au bout d'un 5, 6 semaines, les vivres va manquer. Les vivres va manquer. Oui, oui. Pourquoi tu reviens? Allez, viens, va. Allez, viens, mon gars. Viens.
He would rehearse with the actors for a long time, about 1 hour, 2 hours, all alone with them. And then after, it was very fascinating because he let the actors try to find moves, to find if they sat, what was a good chair, what they liked. He even tried so that if they felt that they felt like having orders, he would try not to give them orders. You know? And then finally, he would help them a little. And when he thought that they had found their nest, then he would begin making rehearsals with the cameraman.
Jean Gabin, who knew very well about actors and acting, told me that Renoir was the only one at that time refusing to have the actors paralyzed or submitted to the technique. And he told me, for instance, that during La Bête Humaine, when he was driving the engine at the beginning, the cameraman, Kurt Courant, told him, Mr. Gabin, I would like you to move more on the left. And Gabin said to me, that was the only time where I saw le gros. I don't know who you said, how you said, the big man? The fat man. He said, very, very angry. He yelled at Courant. He says, Mr. Courant, you must never talk to the actors. You must never, the actors are not your slaves. They are not at your service. You are at their service.
With the commercial success of La Bête Humaine, Jean was at last able to form his own company, La Nouvelle Édition Française, and film an original story. Initially conceived as a classical comedy, La Règle du Jeu, The Rules of the Game, grew into a corrosive satire on the French bourgeoisie, dealing with a web of marital infidelities both upstairs and downstairs over a weekend at a country chateau. Jean himself played Octave, the clumsy go-between whose efforts to please everyone end in disaster. Among the cast was the actress Paulette Dubost, who played a chambermaid.
Il avait un timbre de voix très personnel et qui vous enjôlait. On l'entendait parler, on avait envie de se mettre à genoux devant lui, de faire n'importe quoi pour lui être agréable. Alors tous les jours, c'était des moments de rigolade, c'était toujours des moments de bonne bouffe. Il aimait bien manger. Et il prenait la vie du bon côté, c'était la joie de vivre. Et ça se ressent dans le film.
Je suis très content.
Pourquoi?
Parce que vous êtes près de moi.
Oh, vous êtes bête. Edouard, si tu nous laisses pas tranquille, je vais me plaindre à madame et je te fais chasser.
D'abord, qu'est-ce que tu fais là, toi?
Je fais mon service, tiens, pardi.
Oui, on fait notre service.
Oh, les bottes, mon ami, les bottes. Mais tous ces messieurs attendent après leurs bottes. C'est une véritable révolution dans le château.
It seems to me it's a sort of a quintessential French film. It combines the sort of a wonderful sort of Marivaux-like quality of the comédie à la française, and a sort of a weird social study. Actually quite accurate, quite vigorous and acid, aggressive.
Bonsoir, monsieur. Bonsoir, madame la Bruyère. Bonsoir, petit Jackie. Dis-moi, avant de te coucher, je voulais te demander, qu'est-ce que c'est là que tu étudies, ton art précolombien? C'est l'étude de la civilisation américaine avant l'arrivée de Christophe Colomb. Ah oui, des histoires de nègres. Mais non, madame, il n'y avait pas encore de nègres en Amérique. Mais qu'est-ce qu'il y avait alors? Mais des Indiens. Évidemment, je suis bête. Buffalo Bill.
On se croirait au régiment. La salle avec elle. Oh non, non, ma valise.
This film, which is a film about a weekend in the chateau, in the countryside, between people which today we would call Eurotrash, was in fact a kind of supreme prophecy about the reality of that time. There is this scene in La Règle du Jeu where they go hunting, and there's a massacre of birds and rabbits, and I think Renoir was very, very conscious of the fact that the war was just on the verge of exploding.
Well, it's a pretty shocking movie even today. I mean, imagine, you have this kind of light, satirical, social comedy, and then you suddenly have these rabbits and birds getting killed rather graphically, and then, then it goes into a party sequence, and it's I think when a picture mixes with such extraordinary, black and white, going from comedy to tragedy, going from a party sequence to somebody getting shot and killed. It's a lot for an audience to take.
Messieurs, il s'agit d'un déplorable accident et rien de plus. Mon garde Schumacher a cru voir un braconnier et il a tiré comme c'était son droit. La fatalité a voulu qu'André Jurieux soit victime de cette erreur.
Messieurs, demain nous quitterons le château en pleurant cet ami exquis. Ce compagnon de qualité qui avait su si bien nous faire oublier qu'il était un homme célèbre. Et maintenant, mes chers amis, il fait froid, vous risquez de prendre mal. Je me permets de vous conseiller de rentrer. Demain, nous rendrons nos devoirs à notre ami Jurieux.
Nouvelle définition du mot accident.
Non, cela chez ne manque pas de classe. Et ça devient rare, mon cher Saint-Thomas. Croyez-moi, ça devient rare.
The conclusion of the picture, we have it here.
On those steps.
On those steps, at the end of the picture, with the last word of the picture, when you say that was just an accident. That's the conclusion of the picture. It was just an accident, as any tragedy which happens in our society today.
Yes,
Accidents. We are surrounded with accidents. The war in Indochina is an accident. The cars have accidents. And you don't go along with your wife, it's an accident. Accident. That's the conclusion of the picture.
Yes.
He thought that it was not only a good film, it would be a film that would reveal the French to themselves in a way that hadn't happened on the screen before. There's no question that he was absolutely crushed at its reception. You know, the premiere on July 7th, I think it was, in Paris, was a disaster. The audience hated the film. They howled and whistled and tried to burn down the theater.
Les gens se battaient dans la salle à la sortie du film. Et même mes parents, moi j'étais en Afrique du Nord, et mes parents m'ont écrit en me disant bah, « Tu sais, on n'est pas fiers que tu sois dans le film d'un fou. » Vous vous rendez compte, quand on pense à ça, on se dit c'est pas vrai, c'est pas possible que les gens n'aient pas pu réagir dès le début à ce chef-d'œuvre. Et moi, en le tournant, je me rendais compte de ce que ça allait donner. Hein.
You know, when I show a picture in the beginning, they don't like it. 30 years later, they say it's genial, and I'm a wonderful man, and it's extraordinary, and they cover me with flowers. Too late.
He said, I think later, that he determined then that he either had to give up making films or else leave France. Now that sounds as though that the next time he began to make a film was in Italy, and it sounds as though that was an outcome of his decision to either give up making films or leave France. But as a matter of fact, the offer from Scalera to make Tosca had been made before the Rules of the Game was finished, and before, you know. So he already was dealing with the Italians in terms of making a film there before the failure of the Rules of the Game.
When he left for Rome to make La Tosca, Jean took with him the new woman in his life, Dido Friere, his Brazilian-born script girl who had known him since the 20s. His break from Marguerite and departure to Mussolini's Italy was seen as an act of betrayal by many of his left-wing colleagues.
The Tosca, I didn't know a bloody thing about the Tosca, and it's Jacques Becker told me laughing, but the Tosca is a very anti-dictatorial picture. It's very progressive in a way. So that's why Jean does it. And Jean started with it with Michel Simon, and then suddenly the Italian producer told him, you've got to go, because in 2 days we'll be in war with France. And he came back, and he didn't want to work with Vichy, because he thought that Vichy would push him forward, and he always hated what we would call des attitudes tranchées, to be black or white. He was never black or white.
My father was approached by a representative of the German government that wanted him to become sort of a dictator of the French film. Now, my father was much too intelligent to be brave. So he did not want to say no, because the result might be, say, uncomfortable. And on the other hand, he had no intention of doing that. By sheer luck, his friend Bob Flaherty arranged for him to get a job in Hollywood. And what he did, of course, was, well, he did two things. First of all, he accepted without saying anything. Then he got a visa. And then my father did not want to take any money out of the bank because it could be checked. So I got cash. And that cash would allow him and Dido to get to the United States without anyone knowing that taken any money out. By the time the Germans realized that he was going to say no, he had left.
After travelling through Morocco and Portugal, Jean and Didot finally left for the States in December 1940. As a long-time admirer of the American cinema, he was now to discover for himself just what working in Hollywood was like.